At the National Prayer Breakfast, President Trump vowed to take the country down an extremely dangerous path and said that he is going to totally destroy the barrier that separates church and state. Let's watch.
Among those freedoms is the right to worship according to our own beliefs. That is why I will get rid of and totally destroy the Johnson Amendment and allow our representatives of faith to speak freely and without fear of retribution. I will do that. Remember, freedom of religion is a sacred right, but it is also a right under threat all around us. And the world is under serious, serious threat in so many different ways. And I've never seen it so much and so openly as since I took the position of president. The world is in trouble, but we're going to straighten it out.
Now, religious liberty in the United States is not under threat with respect to Christianity because the overwhelming majority of the country identifies as Christian. But what is under attack is this really important doctrine that separates church and state. In fact, it's fundamental to who we are as a nation, and a way that we can maintain our democracy as it stands and keep the church and state separate is by protecting the Johnson Amendment. Now, what is the Johnson Amendment? NBC News explains the Johnson Amendment is supposed to stop leaders of houses of worship from using their pulpit to campaign for certain politicians. In a broader sense, it affects 501c3 tax-exempt organizations, which includes not only religious institutions, but charities and universities, and says they can't participate in or wield an influence in political campaigns. Now, if churches violate this prohibition, well then their tax-exempt status would be revoked. Now, what Trump wants to do, and in the absence of the Johnson Amendment, well, this would allow churches, mostly mega church pastors, they'd be able to lobby politicians and bribe politicians. So, I mean, you know how large multinational corporations are able to bribe our politicians and turn them into puppets? Well, this is what they want churches to be able to do. They want churches, again, mostly mega church pastors, to be able to bribe politicians and get them to do their bidding. Not happening. We already have corruption when it comes to multinational corporations. I don't want corruption and legalized bribery when it comes to churches as well, because that would set us down a very dangerous path where the United States slowly becomes a theocracy. No, thank you. Now, the Johnson Amendment has basically been under attack since it passed in 1954, and for Donald Trump to override it would be a very dangerous thing. It would set a dangerous precedent, but this isn't the only way that Donald Trump is trying to move us towards a theocracy. So The Independent explains the Donald Trump administration is preparing to enshrine specific religious beliefs in executive policy, including that premarital sex is wrong, that marriage is or should be recognized as between a man and a woman, that life begins at conception, and that the words male and female refer to immutable biological sex assigned at birth. Yeah, you heard that right. President Grab him by the pussy, who was divorced multiple times, wants to violate the First Amendment's Establishment Clause by enshrining religion in the executive branch's policy.
Big league.
How about this, President Trump? Before you declare something immoral, why don't you look in the fucking mirror? Because someone who brags about sexual assault and who's had many women come out and say that you sexually assaulted them, you have no right to talk. Now, the nation actually obtained a draft of this executive order, and it gets worse than that. The draft order seeks to create wholesale exemptions for people and organizations who claim religious or moral objections to same-sex marriage, premarital sex, abortion, and trans identity. And it seeks to curtail women's access to contraception and abortion through the Affordable Care Act. Language in the draft document specifically protects the tax-exempt status of any organization that believes, speaks, or acts or declines to act in accordance with the belief that marriage is or should be recognized as the union of one man and one woman. Sexual relations are properly reserved for such a marriage. Male and female and their equivalents refer to an individual's immutable biological sex as objectively determined by anatomy, physiology, or genetics at or before birth, and that human life begins at conception and merits protection at all stages of life. The breadth of the draft order, which legal experts described as sweeping and staggering, may exceed the authority of the executive branch if enacted. So he's trying to make it legal for religious organizations or companies that have religious people on their board or religious CEOs to discriminate against LGBT people and discriminate against transgender people and discriminate against women and curtail their access to contraception. Donald Trump is trying to bring us back to the 1950s, to the Leave It to Beaver era. Well, I've got news for you, Donald Trump. We're not going back. It's 2017, and it's time that you and your Republican friends stop trying to push for a theocracy in the United States. It's time that we all acknowledge something that is going to be a pretty hard pill to swallow. God's not real. And just like we were forced at one point in life to believe, to acknowledge that Santa is not real and the Tooth Fairy isn't real, well, it's time to acknowledge the harsh truth that God is not real. God doesn't give a shit about you and what you're doing in your bedroom. If God did exist, he'd probably care more about the Syrian refugee crisis. I think he'd probably care more about you sexually assaulting women. He'd probably care about the wars where little children are being killed. I don't think he gives a fuck about who people are choosing to have sex with and the contraception that they're using. That's just me. But let's be real. God does not exist. Grow up. It's time to move on. It's time to stop trying to move the United States towards a theocracy. We don't base policy on your fairy tale. We base policy on facts and empirical reality. So President Trump can try to destroy the Johnson Amendment. He could try to move us closer towards Iran and Saudi Arabia, just like their theocracies. But guess what? You're going to be vigorously opposed because religion is getting less and less popular with younger generations. We're not going to allow this theocracy or push for theocracy to continue.
Support this podcast by joining the independent progressive media revolution today at humanistreport.com.